Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today's guest is Stephen Roach, a renowned scholar at Yale University and a familiar face to those who pay attention to the Chinese economy over the decades. He's a prolific writer and a commentator on China's political, economic, and business issues. He's also a former Asia chair for Morgan Stanley. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you, Wenqi.
We have to touch on the for sale of TikTok legislation that passed the House yesterday. You used a strong word to say it's xenophobic in your tweet. Is that how you would describe certain views of China today?
Well, I think, we have to step back and look at legislation and like this and initiatives elsewhere that have been noted with respect to Washington's views toward China. This bill passed the House by the largest bipartisan majority of any bill in recent memory. I think it was like, I want to say 300, and my recall is not perfect, but roughly 375 to 52 or something like that. Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, they're all dead set against China. And I use the word xenophobic because it's part of a long-standing fear-driven perception that anything that China does that has an impact on the United States should be viewed as a national security threat. This was the case that was made against Huawei with its alleged potential to open the back door on 5G infrastructure. And so Huawei became public enemy number one. This is the case that's being made repeatedly against other activities that China's involved with. U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo last week or the week before raised the possibility that Chinese electric vehicles would be a threat to American roads and American national security. And there are a number of others that I would ask you to think about that have been thrown out as allegations of Chinese threats to national security.
I think it is really interesting, right? Sort of what we're seeing is almost like a culmination of a long time of it almost has become a very convenient scapegoat or, many other things that people can just use China as a way to galvanize domestic support, whether it's politically or even business. But also China, is not doing well. And so it sort of fits what the narrative has been, and it's just become so convenient. So I wanted to ask you, I think that's, there's the fear and the xenophobia, and there's also just a lot of political reasons behind sort of what's going on in terms of U.S.-China relations. But as I said, China is not doing as well. So, we have to talk about the two sessions that just concluded, the 5% GDP growth target, for example. Do you think that's achievable?
I think the target of 5% for this year is achievable. It will be a struggle, just like hitting the growth target last year was a struggle. The Chinese are prepared to use, once again, another strain of what they call proactive fiscal and prudent monetary policy to support the economy. But I worry more about the growth prospects in the years beyond, when China's facing severe demographic headwinds, major productivity issues, and ongoing problems in the property sector and local government finances. And it just gets harder and harder for China to frame of policies to deal with these long-term structural issues. So I think the growth outlook in the years beyond 2024 are increasingly disconcerting.
And you were very bullish on China for a very long time. And you have also said that you were very optimistic about China in general because its ability to reform and had the courage to innovate on a lot of the policy frameworks. But from what you just said, it sounds like you've changed your view. Why is that?
Well, I've changed my view because I think government policy in China now is unfortunately being constrained by what I would call an imagination deficit. They're using an old approach that has worked in the past that it does not seem well aligned with the new problems, especially the structural problems that they face in the future. And that leaves them with the need to boost productivity to really offset the structural pressures coming from a shrinking workforce and excess investment. And the productivity outlook is really deteriorated in recent years, which accounts for my change of view. More and more Chinese activity is being focused on low productivity state-owned enterprises and the high productivity growth sectors in the private economy, especially in the internet platform tech companies, have been constrained by regulatory intrusion. Both public and private sector mix is tilted toward weak productivity rather than the strong productivity that China needs. So I've changed my view accordingly.
So you use the framework as sort of lack of imagination. I want to dig sort of deeper into that because Chinese bureaucrats actually, for those who were in charge of economic policies in general, I would say had a lot of respect from a lot of people from around the world for a long time. And so do you think sort of the current lack of imagination of a new policy framework to address some of the new problems, is it due to the lack of new pipeline of economists, or is it more political? Meaning there is a theory that China's slowdown is a deliberate decision by Beijing to kind of shift the economic growth model from speed, to quality. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I've been lecturing Chinese officials for years, and I'm getting ready to go back to China in about a week to do it again at the China Development Forum on the need to shift away from fixation on quantity to quality. But that approach has its limits because if quality means putting up with unacceptably weak growth rates, then that is very problematic for the political bargain that the Chinese leadership has with the Chinese people to grow its economy at a reasonable rate over the next few decades to hit the growth objectives that Xi Jinping has set out in his policy approach. Quality, though, does mean focusing on productivity, and that's important. And I think the government has recently been focusing on that as well, especially at the two sessions emphasis on new productive factors. I think that's good, but again, it sounds good in theory, but in practice, with the emphasis on low productivity state-owned enterprises and constraining the higher productivity private sector, that remains a real disconnect between what they say and what they do.
Yeah, I think you're, I would say, less optimistic optimistic view of China is also reflected in your view of Hong Kong. Your recent article in the Financial Times, which is entitled, "It Pains Me to Say Hong Kong is Over," drew a lot of attention and reactions from people in Hong Kong. Why did you write that article? And how much do you really think is a cyclical problem, or is it structural? And how much is even political when it comes to Hong Kong's economy right now?
Well, obviously, what caught my attention, and the lead to my article in the FT stressed this, was that when I wrote it in early February, the Hang Seng Index of the Hong Kong stock market had returned to the level that prevailed in July of 1997, when the handover occurred from Great Britain to the PRC. And so for the what had been the world's fourth largest, now the fifth largest stock market, goes nowhere in 25, 26 years, that gets your attention. And that forced me to think about the drivers of Hong Kong. And I really addressed three issues. Number one, the very tight economic linkage with China, and Hong Kong is going to go nowhere in a weak Chinese growth climate. The numbers show that very clearly. Secondly, I thought Hong Kong will be caught in the crossfire between the U.S. and China conflict, which forces Hong Kong's trading partners to pick sides between the U.S. and China. And thirdly, the political issues. The imposition of Beijing's national security law on Hong Kong in 2020 has now been followed by the likely prompt passage of Hong Kong's own Article 23 national security law. Hong Kong's losing any semblance of political autonomy. So is Hong Kong over? I mean, the headline overstates, my conclusion, but Hong Kong's in serious trouble as a dynamic, thriving, free market driven culture that, Milton Friedman of all people said was his favorite example of a free market in the world.
Yeah, I am curious how you think about this, because some people who may have a different view on Hong Kong's future would say Hong Kong is now going to be integrated into this greater Bay Area, which includes Shenzhen and other parts of southern China. And so, as a whole, the whole regional economic growth is more promising, and therefore, it is better for Hong Kong's future, rather than looking at Hong Kong as just one single place, as an international and finance hub. How would you respond to that kind of view?
Well, let me just say that there's been very intense pushback on the article that I wrote.
Many reactions and people.
I've heard a lot of strong reactions, and that's one of them. And so I wrote a rebuttal to the criticism in the South China Morning Post a couple of weeks later, and I pointed out that the Greater Bay Area is certainly has great potential as an integrated urban center in driving growth in China. But, is this going to be Hong Kong's savior, or is this going to just turn Hong Kong into more of a marginal a player in China? There are two bigger cities, two more dynamic cities in the Greater Bay Area, not just Shenzhen, but also Guangzhou. And I think the risk is that Hong Kong, if all it's got to fall back on is the Greater Bay Area, then it does risk becoming just another big Chinese city that undermines its character and its dynamism and its spirit.
Well, when you look at Hong Kong over the last few years, it's hard not to think about Taiwan. And so what would you say are the lessons learned if you were to advise Taiwan?
Well, there's the similarities, and then there's a lot of differences. Taiwan is larger, with a far more dynamic source of growth in its tech area, especially its world-class semiconductor platform. And so Taiwan has optionality that a services-driven Hong Kong does not have. But the obvious lesson is political. Hong Kong became unhinged with the demonstrations of late 2019, and that prompted a response from Beijing to impose controls over the growing examples of political instability that bordered on property destruction and anarchy. And should similar conditions take place in Taiwan, then obviously there would be a strong political response from Beijing as well. And Beijing has made it very clear that if you want to talk about red lines, there are some obvious and important red lines on with respect to Taiwan that will prompt action.
Well, the Taiwan issue is the red line issue between U.S. and China. And you, in your latest book, Accidental Conflict, you believe that false negative narratives between China and the U.S. may lead to an accidental conflict. Can you elaborate on that thesis, especially on the China side, since we're very familiar with sort of the false or lack of complete information about China on the U.S. side, but how were the narratives created in China these days about the United States?
Well, briefly, the theory of accidental conflict is that both sides have mistaken fears and impressions of the other. The U.S., to the first point we discussed regarding TikTok, everything China does is a national security threat. You hear warnings from all of our politicians, including our FBI director, that China is about to destabilize America. And I focused a lot on the economic false narratives where the trade deficit with China, the U.S. trade deficit with China, while it's big, is only one of 106 bilateral trade deficits. And we have trade deficits because we don't save, not because of what China is perceived to do with respect to unfair trading practices. China has a lot of false narratives of the U.S. And number one is that China is convinced that the U.S. wants to contain and suppress economic growth. And the bottom line is these narratives create an interplay of mutual misunderstanding that drives both nations to treat each other more out of fear and impressions that do not really align with reality, so that when a spark comes along, whether it's problems in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, then they can immediately escalate and get out of control and lead to accidental conflict. So we got to get our narratives right and have a better mutual understanding, a more of a trust-based give and take, to be, I think, in a better position to address risks like those which are evident in Taiwan.
Well, speaking of getting the narratives right, I think this year, since it's the presidential election year in the US, is probably going to be a challenge. What worries you the most about the US-China relations over the next 12 months? Is it just the process of going through the US presidential election? And what if there is a second Trump administration? How should the world be prepared?
Well, that's a loaded question. And no one knows how the election's going to go, and Trump has already thrown out some threats of raising tariffs across the board, and with a particularly sharp increase in existing tariffs on China, which would be hugely destabilizing to the Chinese economy and to the broader world. We had a summit last November in Woodside, California, where both leaders came together and underscored the need to de-risk and restabilize the relationship. There are 4 working groups that have been established that are starting to meet too sporadically for me, but addressing mutual issues. In China, they call it the vision of San Francisco. Is that enough to withstand, another unexpected development? I mean, you have a new president who is going to give an inaugural address on May 20th. What's he going to say? Is he going to rock the boat with respect to Taiwanese independence? That could certainly destabilize an admittedly precarious stability right now that exists between the U.S. and China. And I am not in the business of predicting future shocks, but I think the level of engagement right now is still tenuous at best, and could certainly suffer a setback should something unexpected happen over the course of 2024.
Well, you mentioned there's going to be a new president in Taiwan and will be inaugurated on May 20th. What would be your advice to him and his administration, given where the world is right now? What is the best role for Taiwan to play, whether it's politically or economically?
Don't rock the boat. Just, maintain the status quo. Do not become a stalking horse for frictions with China or Taiwanese independence. Any of those issues would clearly trigger a response from Beijing, and that would obviously cause problems between the United States and China, with broad global implications. We live in a very precarious, unstable world right now. We've got wars in Europe and in the Middle East. The last thing we need is an outbreak of conflict, accidental or not, in Asia.
Well, last question, since you have been the go-to person to assess a lot of risks in the world, and what are the biggest risks today for investors that they would come to you to ask for advice for?
Well, everybody wants to know about the fate of the Chinese economy, and my view, which has been, as you alluded to earlier, optimistic for a long time, is now more cautious, and I remain cautious. There's general view here that the world itself is on the cusp of a soft landing. I think the IMF has also indicated that in its latest update of the World Economic Outlook. I'm skeptical of that. I think world growth is being projected at about 3% over the next 5 years. That's below trend, and doesn't give the world economy much of a cushion to withstand the blow of shocks, which have become all too inevitable. We've talked about a few of them earlier in this interview, but should a slow-growing global economy be hit by another shock, then the global environment could quickly turn negative, and investors right now are completely unprepared for that possibility.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen, as always. We'll be looking forward to reading news and hopefully transcript of your speech at the China Development Forum, which is obviously going to be, convening a lot of important policymakers and business leaders. We'd love to hear what your advice is to China today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.